The world had frozen at 40 degrees below. The air itself was a knife, sharp enough to cut the breath from a man's lungs. It was an absolute brittle cold that locked the rivers and split the ancient pines. In this white silence, the cabin of Jonas Rowan stood against the wind. It was old, built of logs felled 3 decades prior, and now it belonged to his grandson, Eli. Eli Rowan watched from the cabin's small, ice-caked window. He was not looking at the mountains, which were sharp and blue in the cruel light. He was looking at the smoke. It was the wrong kind of smoke. Not the thin, clean plume from his own chimney, but a thick, greasy black stain rising from the valley floor. It rose from the ashes of his supply cache. Everything he had to survive the deep winter, the salted meat, the flour, the extra powder, the marten pelts he'd already trapped, was gone. He had seen the riders. He knew the name. Silas Vane. Vane, who believed the mountains belonged only to the strong, and that strength was measured in what a man could take. Eli opened the heavy door. The cold hit him like a solid wall. The sound of the wind was the only sound left. It was a hungry sound. He walked 100 yards to the ruin. The snow squeaked under his moccasins. The fire was already dying, starved by the intense cold, leaving only blackened timbers and the sickening smell of burnt grain and rendered fat. He knelt. He touched the charred wood of a storage crate his grandfather had built. It was still faintly warm, an ember of loss in a world of ice. He had nothing now. He had the cabin, yes. But a cabin is just a wooden box without food. It is a coffin waiting for a corpse. Vane had not attacked Eli directly. He hadn't needed to. He had attacked the future. He had left Eli to the cold. The cold would be the executioner, the thermographer, the final judgment. Eli stood up, pulling his collar tighter. The wind moved through the pines, a low moan. He looked back at the cabin. It was dark, solid, unmoving. It was his only inheritance. His grandfather had built it not just as a shelter in this high contested valley, but as a statement, a place of peace, a place of trade, a place where a man's word was the only law. Silas Vane had spat on that law. He had declared that the old ways were dead, buried with the old man. Eli looked at the frozen peaks. They were indifferent, vast, and eternal. They had seen empires rise and fall in the canyons below. They would watch him too. He turned his back to the ruin. He walked back to the cabin. The test had begun. He closed the door, the heavy oak thudding shut, and the silence of the room wrapped around him. It was the silence of legacy, the silence of 40 degrees, and the silence of a promise waiting to be kept. This valley, the one the Arapaho called Watebe, the Valley of the Quiet Pine, was a hard place to live, but it was a good place. It held water when other streams ran dry. It held elk when the plains were empty. Jonas Rowan had come here 30 years ago. He had come not with a rifle first, but with an open hand. He had met the elders of the Arapaho. He had learned their words. He had respected their ways. He did not trap the sacred streams. He did not hunt the spirit elk. In return, they had shown him this place, this high meadow protected by granite walls. And here Jonas built his cabin. He built it slow. He built it right. He used the best pine, quarter-felled in the dark of the moon so the sap was low. He chinked it not just with mud and grass, but with respect. He built a fireplace of river stone that drew true and threw heat deep into the room. It was more than a shelter. It was an embassy. It became a place of trade. Not a fort, like the American Fur Company built, full of whiskey and suspicion. It was a meeting place. Jonas traded powder for hides, steel knives for quill work, wool blankets for knowledge. He learned the mountain. He learned the winter. He learned that survival was not about fighting the land, but about being accepted by it. The Arapaho called him Nenitute, he who sits straight. His word was his bond. He lived there until the white sickness took him, and he was buried on the ridge overlooking the valley. Years passed. The world changed. The beaver trade died. Gold seekers came, then left. But the cabin remained. And now Eli, his grandson, had come. He had come to live the life the old man had taught him. He was quiet, like his grandfather. He knew the signs. He knew the language. When he arrived in the late fall, the valley seemed to welcome him. The old Arapaho elder, stone in hand, had come to see him. Stone in hand was a man of immense dignity, his face a map of seasons. He had known Jonas. He looked at Eli, studying him. He looked at the cabin, which Eli had spent a month repairing, remudding the chinking, clearing the chimney, stacking wood mountain high. "Your grandfather's hands are in this wood," Stone in hand said, his voice quiet. "His spirit is in the stone." Eli had simply nodded, offering tobacco. The alliance was fragile, built on memory. It was not yet his, it was his grandfather's. Eli had to earn it. But there was another man who watched this valley. Silas Vane. Vane ran a string of trappers who worked for the new trading companies. They were hard men who saw the Arapaho as pests and the valley as untapped profit. Vane wanted the Watebe. He wanted it for his own. He hated the cabin. He hated the memory of Jonas Rowan. It represented a world of honor and limits. Vane recognized no limits. He saw Eli's quiet respect, not as strength, but as weakness. He saw the legacy as a relic, ready to be burned and forgotten. The valley wasn't big enough for both their codes. The first snows had fallen. The elk moved down. The air grew sharp. Vane decided it was time to erase the past. The confrontation happened 3 days before the fire. The air was already cold, the sky a flat, grey sheet. Eli was splitting the last of his firewood when Vane and 4 of his men rode into the clearing. Their horses were lathered, their faces grim. Vane was a large man, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat, his beard stiff with frost. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the new snow. He didn't look at Eli. He looked at the cabin. He studied the tight chinking, the high, solid roof, the neat stack of wood. "This is my valley, boy," Vane said. His voice was rough, like gravel. Eli didn't stop his axe. He set another log and split it with a clean thwack. He stacked the wood before turning. "This cabin was built by Jonas Rowan," Eli said. His voice was calm. "It stands on Arapaho land, by their leave." Vane laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The Arapaho, a freezing, starving band of beggars. Their leave means nothing." He stepped closer. His men spread out, their hands on their rifles. "Your grandfather was a fool. He traded for scraps when he could have taken fortunes. He died with nothing." "He died respected," Eli said. The air between them was electric, colder than the wind. "Respect don't fill a wagon with pelts," Vane sneered. "I'm taking this valley. The streams are full. The passes are clear. I'm building a new post here, a real one. You will take your grandfather's memory, and you will be gone by the next full moon, or you will be buried next to him." Eli looked at the mountains, then back at Vane. "I am not leaving." Vane's eyes narrowed. He saw the stillness in Eli. The boy was not afraid. He was anchored. This infuriated Vane. He couldn't bully him. He couldn't buy him. He couldn't escape the quiet judgment in Eli's eyes. It was the same judgment he'd seen in the old man, Jonas. Vane smiled, a terrible, slow smile. "Then you're a fool, just like him. You think these logs will protect you? You think his memory will keep you warm?" He turned abruptly. "Let's ride." He mounted his horse. "The mountain will decide," Vane called back, "and the mountain is hungry." They rode out, their hoofbeats swallowed by the snow. Eli knew it was not over. It was a declaration of war. He spent the next 2 days securing his pelts, checking his supplies, reinforcing the door. He felt the legacy of the cabin settle onto his shoulders. It was not just wood and stone. It was a fortress of honor. Then, on the 3rd day, the deep cold hit, the 40 wind, and under the cover of that wind, Vane's men returned. They didn't ride to the cabin. They rode to the cache. Eli smelled the smoke too late. He ran out, rifle in hand, but they were already ghosts disappearing into the swirling snow. He watched it burn. He watched his survival turned to ash. Vane hadn't attacked the man. He had attacked the life. He left Eli to the cold, trapped in his grandfather's legacy, to see which one would break first. Eli stood in the snow, the wind tearing at him. He made no vow of vengeance. He made no oath of blood. He simply looked at the cabin, his jaw set. "You built it to last, old man," he whispered to the wind. "Let's see if you built me to last too." He went inside. He barred the door. The siege had begun. The next morning, the temperature dropped even further. The world outside the cabin was a howling white void. The sun was a pale, indifferent smear behind the ice-filled sky. This was the true test. This was the thermographer. The cold began its work, scanning the cabin for any flaw, any weakness, any gap in Jonas Rowan's craftsmanship. Eli was now in a battle not against Vane, but against physics. He was fighting the loss of heat. The fireplace, built of thick riverstone, was the heart of the cabin. Eli fed it sparingly. He couldn't afford to burn his wood too fast. He had enough to last the winter if he was careful. But now, with no food, lasting meant something else. He had his rifle, but in this blizzard, nothing moved. The elk and deer were hunkered down in the deep canyons. To hunt was to die. He was a prisoner of the legacy he'd sought to protect. He spent the first day reinforcing. The cold was a living thing. It pressed against the walls. It found the smallest cracks. Eli took the leftover mud he'd mixed for chinking, now frozen solid, and brought it inside to thaw by the fire. He worked his way around the room, inch by inch, pressing the mud into seams the cold had widened. The old logs, felled by his grandfather, held true. They were seasoned, dense, and interlocked with a skill few men possessed, but the wind was relentless. It found the gaps around the window frame. Frost began to build inside the cabin. It coated the walls thick and white. The cabin was breathing. It was inhaling the cold. Eli stuffed the gaps with scraps of hide, with spare cloth, with anything that would blunt the edge of the wind. He ate his last strip of jerky. The hunger began. It was a cold, hollow feeling that mirrored the world outside. The second day was worse. The wind didn't stop. It shrieked. It sounded like a woman weeping, then like a panther screaming. The sounds twisted his mind. He sat wrapped in his buffalo robe, close to the fire, but the cold crept up his back. The floor was a sheet of ice. The water in his bucket was solid rock. To drink, he had to melt snow, which cost him precious firewood. He felt his energy leaking away. The results were coming in. The cabin was strong. The logs held. The stones held. But the man inside was failing. He was the weak link. He was the heat leak. He thought of his grandfather. Had he ever faced this? Had he ever been this alone? On the third day, the hunger was a sharp pain. The cold had numbed his feet. He knew the signs. He was freezing slowly from the extremities inward. He moved less. He stared into the fire. The cabin was a good, strong box. But Vane was right. It was just wood. It couldn't feed him. It couldn't save him. He was drowsy. The cold was inviting him to sleep. It was a warm, comfortable feeling. This was the trap. This was the end. He was failing the cabin. He was failing the memory. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. He would rest. Just for a moment. He woke to a sound, a hard thump on the door, not the wind. He struggled to lift his head. The fire was low. The room was dark, filled with shadows and frost. Thump, thump, thump. He grabbed his rifle. It was too cold to hold. The metal burned his skin. "Who's there?" His voice was a dry croak. The bar was heavy. He fumbled with it, his fingers useless. The door pushed open, and a figure entered, cloaked in snow. It was stone in hand. The Arapaho elder stepped inside, followed by two younger men. They were covered in ice, their faces hard with the journey. Stone in hand looked at Eli, wrapped in the robe. He looked at the empty food shelf. He looked at the frost on the walls. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding a deep, ancient knowledge. "We saw the smoke," Stone in Hand said. "Vane's smoke. We knew he would leave you to the mountain." The two young men unslung packs. They brought dried meat. They brought medicine bags. They brought fat wood to revitalize the fire. They had walked through the 40 storm. They had come. The alliance his grandfather built, the respect he had shown. It was not just a memory. It was shelter. It was food. It was life. The results were in. The cabin had held. But the legacy, the bond of honor, was what saved him. The storm broke 2 days later. The world was scoured clean, silent and blindingly white. Eli was weak, but he was alive. The dried meat and the Arapaho broth had brought him back from the edge. The cabin was warm again, the fire roaring. Stone in Hand sat by the hearth, smoking his pipe, the smoke rising straight in the still air. He had not spoken much. He watched. He observed. He was the thermographer, reading the heat not of the walls, but of the heart. Eli worked, cleaning his rifle, mending a moccasin. The silence was comfortable, filled with shared understanding. "Your grandfather built a strong house," Stone in Hand said, his voice a low rumble. "The logs are good. The stone is strong." Eli nodded. It held the cold. "A house is not just wood," the elder said. He tapped his chest. "It is the idea of the house. Jonas Rowan built this house with honor. It keeps the cold out, yes, but it was built to let friends in." He looked at Eli. "Vane sees only the wood. He sees only the valley. He does not see the spaces between the trees. He does not see the honor that holds the world together. He thought he could burn your food and the cold would kill you. He does not understand. The cold only kills that which is alone." Just then, the sound of horses came from the valley. Eli grabbed his rifle. Stone in Hand put a calming hand on his arm. "They are here." Eli looked out the window. It was Silas Vane and his men. They were riding slowly, picking their way through the deep drifts. Vane looked surprised. He had come to see the result. He had come to find a frozen cabin, a dead man. Instead, he saw smoke rising. He saw Arapaho ponies tied outside, strong and steady. He saw Stone in Hand and Eli step out of the cabin onto the porch. Vane halted his horse. His face darkened. This was not the result he expected. Eli stood tall, his rifle held loosely in his arm. Stone in Hand stood beside him, unarmed, wrapped in his buffalo robe. The elder's presence was heavier than any rifle. "You are not welcome here, Silas Vane," Eli said. His voice was strong now, filled with the warmth of the fire and the strength of the alliance. Vane looked at Stone in Hand. "This is not your fight, old man. This is between me and the boy." Stone in Hand stepped forward into the snow. "You are wrong," the elder said. "You burned the cache. You attacked a friend of the Nenitoot. You attacked the memory of Jonas Rowan. You attacked us." Vane looked around. His men were shifting uneasily. They knew the Arapaho. They knew what it meant to have them as an enemy. "This valley is trapped," Vane blustered. "It's my claim." "The mountain does not belong to you," Stone in Hand said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the frozen snow. "You came here with cold in your heart. You burned a man's survival. That is not strength, it is weakness, it is fear. You saw this cabin," he gestured to the solid logs, "and you saw only timber. You did not see the promise. You did not see the respect that holds it together." He pointed at Eli. "He is not alone. His grandfather's word is still warm. We are his chinking. We are his fire. This valley will not hold you, Silas Vane. There is no warmth for you here. The results are in. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you are empty." Vane looked at the cabin, then at the elder, then at Eli. He saw no fear, he saw only judgment. He had lost. He had not been beaten by a bullet. He had been beaten by a memory. He had been beaten by honor. Silas Vane said nothing. He could not fight the Arapaho and the winter. Not for this. His men were already looking toward the pass, eager to leave this place of cold judgment. Vane stared at Eli, his eyes filled with a hatred that was as cold as the air. But it was a hollow hatred. It had no power. He pulled his horse's head around viciously. "This ain't over," he spat. But it was. He rode away, his men following, a dark line receding against the white snow. They did not look back. Eli watched them go. He felt no victory, only a deep, quiet understanding. He turned to Stone in Hand. "Thank you." The elder nodded. "Jonas Rowan paid for that meat 30 years ago," he said. "The debt is paid. The circle is closed." They spent the next days in the quiet of the valley. The cold held, but the cabin was a place of life. Stone in Hand and his men shared their knowledge. They showed Eli how to find the small willow branches, the APII, beneath the snow, whose inner bark could be scraped for sustenance. They showed him how to read the deeper signs of the winter, how to predict the wind, how to bank his fire with sod so it would burn slow and hot for days. Eli listened. He was no longer just the inheritor. He was a student. He understood now that the cabin was not the legacy. The cabin was just the tool. The legacy was the way his grandfather had lived. It was the respect he had earned, the alliances he had forged, the word he had kept. Eli realized that Vane's attack, his thermography of fire and cold, had revealed the cabin's true integrity. It wasn't about the logs. It was about the bonds. The structure held because the relationships held. The warmth didn't just come from the hearth. It came from the memory of honor. It came from a debt paid across generations. When Stone in Hand looked at the cabin, he wasn't just seeing wood his friend had stacked. He was seeing a promise his friend had made, a promise to be a good neighbor, a promise to respect the land, a promise that Vane, with all his rifles and all his greed, could never understand. Vane lived a life of taking. Jonas Rowan had lived a life of building. And what he built had lasted. It had lasted through the fire. It had lasted through the 40 winter. It had lasted long enough to save his grandson. This was the result. The cabin was strong, not because it kept the world out, but because it was built in a way that invited the right parts of the world in. When the thaw finally came, the valley was reborn. The sound of running water returned, a music Eli thought he might never hear again. The ice on the high peaks glittered. The first green shoots pushed up through the snow. Stone in Hand and his men prepared to leave. They were returning to their own village, down in the foothills. Eli stood with the elder by the cabin door. He gave them the last of his grandfather's tobacco and 3 steel knives he had kept hidden. It was a small gift, but it was given with a full heart. "You will stay," Stone in Hand stated. It was not a question. "I will stay," Eli confirmed. "This is my home. I will rebuild the cache." "Good," the elder said. He looked up at the ridge where Jonas Rowan was buried. "Your grandfather sleeps well. The valley of the quiet pine is safe. Nenitut, he who sits straight." He had called Eli by his grandfather's name. It was the greatest honor he could bestow. Eli watched them ride away, their forms diminishing against the vast greening landscape. He turned and looked at the cabin. It was just a small box of logs under a giant sky, but it was the strongest thing in the mountains. It was anchored by more than foundation stones. He picked up his axe. He had work to do. The moral of the trial was clear. A man's life is like a cabin in the high country. It is tested by the cold, it is tested by hunger, and it is tested by the greed of other men. Some men build their lives with walls of fear, trying to keep the world out. But those walls always leak. They grow cold. They fail. But a life built on honor, a life built on respect given and respect earned, that is a structure that holds warmth. It is a shelter that friends will travel through a blizzard to protect. The truest measure of a man, the final result of his life, is not the cold he keeps out. It is the warmth he keeps in. If you enjoyed this story, stay a while longer by the fire. There are more tales from the high country, where honor rides the wind.